Hello. Let me just start by saying Demon's Souls is one of the best Souls games you'll probably never play. Now, unlike its sequel Dark Souls, which eventually gained a massive cult following, Demon's Souls has a cult following, but it's absolutely astounding the amount of people that have never set foot in the world of Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls had the unfortunate fate of being a PlayStation exclusive. Thus, being a PlayStation exclusive, it was always only going to be accessible to the audience on the PlayStation ecosystem. And furthermore, the punishing and unforgiving gameplay of Demon's Souls made the game even more niche. And although Demon's Souls sold well, it didn't hit Sony's highest sales expectations, and thus it was ultimately deemed a failure at the time. PlayStation boss Shuhei Yoshida himself couldn't beat Demon's Souls, and thus he deemed the game crap. He would go on to elaborate that, for my personal experience playing Demon's Souls, when it was almost final, I spent around 2 hours playing it, and after all that time, I was still stuck at the beginning of the game. I told myself, this is crap. This is an unbelievable bad game. So I stopped and I put it aside. We underestimated the quality of Demon's Souls, and to be honest, the media in Japan did the same. We definitely dropped the ball from a publisher's perspective, including the studio management side of things. We were not able to grasp the value of the product. And thus, Demon's Souls was deemed a failure. When your boss states that your product is unbelievably bad, it must be extremely discouraging and extremely disheartening. And if it wasn't for the efforts of Hidetaka Miyazaki to go on and believe in his product, we may never have got the Soul series to begin with. Now, it's easy to throw shade at Shuhei Yoshida for his take on what would become the game that is Demon's Souls. When you put out such a piss poor take and the media is apparently doing something similar, it's easy to see how that can become the dominant narrative. And when players hear this narrative, many of them will be dissuaded from buying the game in general. But the truth is, I actually had a very similar experience to Yoshida at the time when Demon's Souls came out. So in a way, I kinda know where he's coming from. At the time when Demon's Souls first came out, it was the golden era of the Call of Duty shooter. Most players who were playing online would spend their time in Call of Duty lobbies or Destiny lobbies. I myself spent a fuck ton of time playing games like Black Ops 2, Unreal Tournament, Soul Calibur 4, and Destiny. But there was always that one player on your friends list that would be playing Demon's Souls. One day, as I was serving up my buddy a piping hot tray of ass whooping in Vehicle Capture the Flag in Unreal, he asked me a very simple question. A question that would go on to haunt me for years. And the question was, have you ever played Demon's Souls? Simple as that. Have you ever played Demon's Souls? Now look, if you were to look at my PlayStation profile, it becomes pretty obvious that I'm one of those players that plays a little bit of everything that isn't a sports game. But Demon's Souls, the only time I had ever even heard of Demon's Souls is when I seen this guy playing it on my friends list. So one day I was at GameStop, and what do I see sitting on the shelf? Demon's Souls. It's like the game was looking right at me. So I picked the game up because the game was only $12.99, maybe less than that. I remember being super excited to play Demon's Souls. I remember reading the back of the cover the whole ride home on the bus, and upon getting home, I ate a little bit of lunch and I booted up Demon's Souls. Now, I don't remember a whole lot from my first time playing Demon's Souls, but what I do remember is waking up in the Nexus and thinking to myself, what the fuck do I do from here? Like, where do I go now? And I remember wandering around the Nexus and reading a bunch of messages that were on the floor, messages that I didn't realize were from other players. I spent about a good 45 minutes roaming around the Nexus, trying to figure out where to go, and it may have been explained to me, but back in those days, I always felt like I already immediately knew what to do, so I would always immediately spam X through the dialogue because I usually had no problem figuring it out along the way. But Demon's Souls is not that type of game. Oftentimes in Souls games, there's no objective marker telling you where to go. But if you actually take the time and listen to what people are telling you, usually they give you more than enough information that you'll need to make your way to the next destination. At the time, this was a foreign concept to me. Somehow, I managed to make my way to Boletaria, which logic would tell you to go to first. Upon arrival in Boletaria, I remember being greeted by this group of hollows, and I remember trying to group these guys all up so I can take them out in one foul swoop. And I remember I absolutely died immediately. My only reaction was, what the fuck? I had no clue what just transpired, and I remember doing it a second time and I immediately died. So eventually I came to the conclusion that I need to take things extremely slow. So I spawned back in for a third time, and I remember taking things slow. I remember not knowing where to go, and this overwhelming feeling of dread that just seemed to be hanging over my head as I made my way through this harsh environment. Somehow, I managed to make my way onto the castle wall of Boletaria, and I was greeted by this Black Knight. This dude busted through my guard almost immediately and absolutely obliterated me. I remember fighting my way back up to that Black Knight several times because in my mind, I had one goal, and that was to skullfuck this guy. But I didn't skullfuck that guy, I didn't end up killing him, and I never ended up making it past him. Now, this could have all been very easily circumvented by looking up a guide and learning some very simple lessons. Some lessons that would follow you throughout your entire playthrough in the Souls series, but I never did that. I had way too much pride to look up a guide, and there is a reason pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, because it would be a little over 10 years before I would go back to the Demon's Souls series and beat the game. For some reason, even though I had never made it past that first section in Demon's Souls, I was so deeply infatuated with the Souls series. It became something that was a part of me, and I would watch a lot of lore videos as well as read a lot of Dark Souls lore. But at that time in my life in particular, I wouldn't dare buy a Dark Souls game for the simple fact that I couldn't beat Demon's Souls. I couldn't even get past the beginning section. So obviously this series isn't for me, right? Well, eventually I would pick up Dark Souls and I would take the time to learn all the lessons I needed to beat Dark Souls. And eventually, the PlayStation 5 would drop, and one of the bundles that would be packaged with the PlayStation 5 was the Demon's Souls Remastered Edition. And eventually, I would pick that bundle up and I would go on to beat Demon's Souls. And because of my pride, it would be over 10 years before I actually beat the original Souls game that is Demon's Souls. There is a reason why pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, because it can cost you a lot in more ways than one. Demon's Souls had the unfortunate fate of releasing during the golden age of Call of Duty. This was a time of instant gratification. Games like Call of Duty and Destiny were hard at work trying to wire players' brains so that players would see the benefits of an incremental dopamine rush that games like Call of Duty and Destiny provide. Because when it comes down to it, when you look at a game like Call of Duty is the definition of junk food. It's really easy to pick up and it's extremely hard to put down. And it tastes extremely good. Whereas a game like Demon's Souls is the full course meal. It's perfectly balanced, and it may not be what you want, but it is absolutely what you need. My problem when I started playing Demon's Souls was extremely simple. I underestimated the importance of blocking. In Demon's Souls, there are 2 truly great forms of defense, and that's blocking and dodging. But in most other games that came out at the time, the best defense was an overwhelming offense. But this is not the case for Demon's Souls. Not only did I underestimate the importance of blocking, but I also underestimated the importance of stamina management. Then on top of all of that, I would look at my gear statistics, but I really didn't understand them. I understood the backstab mechanic, but as a new player, I didn't have enough confidence to actually pull it off. I found everything so intimidating. But one thing I realized as I got older and I actually beat the game is that what actually intimidated me is my lack of understanding. Now, Demon's Souls is still one of the best Souls games in my opinion, because in my opinion, there's actually no truly bad Souls games, and your perspective on a certain Souls game all depends on how you look at things. Now, while Demon's Souls is a great game, it's certainly not perfect by any means. Now, a lot of players would argue that the bosses in Demon's Souls are subpar, and I could see how you might think that, especially if you don't know the backstory behind some of the bosses. And while some of the bosses suffer from a lack of identity, other bosses suffer from poor AI. Now, while some people may take issue with Demon's Souls bosses, I absolutely love the bosses in Demon's Souls. In fact, the only thing that really annoyed me while playing, and it's really only an issue on your first playthrough, is if you plan to go for some of the achievements and trophies in Demon's Souls, some of the bosses require you to kill them in a very specific way, thus depriving you of what could have been a truly epic boss fight, or at least the first time around. But this is largely remedied in New Game Plus, assuming you went for the trophies the first time around. But if you're a player that doesn't care about trophies, then this probably isn't too much of an issue to you. Now, while some players may take issue with the environments in Demon's Souls, unlike other Souls game, there was actually no environment in Demon's Souls that I personally didn't enjoy. And while some players may think the game is relatively easy, this is largely remedied in New Game Plus, as in New Game Plus, the game is much more difficult. Now, Demon's Souls is still a great game, and ironically, it's one of the Souls games that a lot of people most likely will not play. And the funny thing about Demon's Souls is still a PlayStation exclusive. Sony still owns the IP that is Demon's Souls. So hopefully, one day I still hold out hope that we may get a Demon's Souls 2. Anyway, thank you guys for listening. I greatly appreciate it. I'm not sure if anyone is going to watch this video, but in my next video, I want to do a full breakdown on the story that is Demon's Souls. It's going to be quite a bit of work, but if you're interested, stick around or at least keep an ear to the channel. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.